Hi there, Jane. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Maybe I
Lovely.
could start with asking you just a bit of background on your experience in workforce strategy, workforce management.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. I have been in this space probably, I'm going to say for started 25 years ago. In sort of grew up in big consulting firms, sort of IT consulting, then after that, and then have spent the last sort of 10 years in financial services. And really the word workforce management became a thing for me when I moved into financial services and started looking at the workforce as a kind of as a whole, as a kind of
Yeah.
consolidated thing.
Yeah, awesome. And
Yeah.
you would have seen a lot of
A lot
you
of
would have seen a
experience.
lot in the last 25 years
Yeah, for
in
sure.
workforce management.
Yeah.
What are you seeing particularly in relation to what we all kind of term contingent workforce management?
Um, I see an increasing need, given legislation like closing loopholes and all that sort of stuff in Australia. I see an increasing need to understand what we're dealing with, how many we have, how much do they cost, who are they, what are our obligations that exist around that workforce. And then, I hate to use the old line of skills shortage, which seems to have been a thing for 25 years. Really understanding that workforce from the lens of what capability do they bring to bear.
So, Jane, in your experience, what have you seen by way of changes in the workforce mix of employees and contingent workers in the last 5 years?
Yeah, great question. I think, if we look at what's happened in the last 5 years, the biggest thing is COVID.
Mm.
And then most recently, the kind of increase in AI and automation
Mm.
has really significantly kind of changed the landscape. And so that's driving businesses to think about skills and capabilities differently.
Mm.
And how do you get the best use of that?
Mm.
The legislation obviously that's come in over the last little while is changing the dynamic
Yes.
around contingent labour. And organisations are having to get their heads around it, like deeply, not
Yes.
just at a superficial level. How many contracts do we have? But what are these people actually working on?
Yes.
And are they actually permanent staff that we're just calling something different?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
And are you seeing that there's a rise of contingent workers across organisations and how they use that workforce?
Um, I would say, yeah, it's a good question. In the organisations that I've worked for in the last sort of 10 years,
Yep.
there's been a drive to reduce contingent labour,
Yeah.
deemed employment risk,
Yeah.
all of that sort of stuff, loss of IP, all that.
Mm.
So I've sort of seen them decline because it's an expensive part of the workforce.
Yeah.
It is absolutely part of the workforce, but it's expensive. And so that, again, that's another reason that organisations are increasingly having to get their head around it.
Mm. What would you say the benefits that a company would be able to leverage in using I guess, a more complex workforce,
Yeah,
including contingent workers?
yeah. I mean, the obvious benefit is flexibility.
Yeah.
As things like COVID, come
Yeah.
along, and organisations need to change their cost profile and their workforce profile rapidly.
Yeah.
That's where contingent labour becomes very useful.
Mm.
Also, though, and this I think has been around for a while, the need to be able to access skills that you don't necessarily want to own. And
Yeah.
then the flip side, accessing skills that you can't get fast enough
Sure.
in your own workforce. So
Yeah.
they're kind of the benefits to organizations for sure.
Yeah. I think in my experience, I see companies leverage a contingent workforce for scale. So if they
Yeah.
need to scale up,
Yeah.
or as you said, to access skills that they don't need in their business in the long term, or
Yeah.
they need to inject capability into that organization.
Yeah. Absolutely right.
What would you say the two or three key call outs that companies need to be aware of from a risk profile with the use of non-employees or contingent workers?
Yeah. That's a really great question. The biggest risk, you can look at the risks in different ways, right? The biggest risk that I see and hear leaders talk about often is the IP risk.
Right.
So they're building capability in a workforce that they don't really control, if you know what I mean. And that's not, maybe not a great word, but the IP risk is high. The deemed employment risk on the flip side of that is high, particularly with the legislation that's come in. And, I mean, so I think the risk around deemed employment is high. And then the other risk is that you have too much of your cost base in part of the workforce that can just kind of walk away, with very little notice.
So, Jane, I'm interested to understand your perspective on the risk profile of using contingent workers. I hear many of my customers say, I don't know who's in my workforce, which means that they may not know who's got access to buildings or systems or laptops or assets.
Absolutely.
What's your take on that?
I completely agree. I think I have, across all of the organisations that I've worked with in the last 20, 25 years, that is the single biggest problem. And the ways that they go about trying to solve it, twisting and turning over, trying to get access to, or trying to get a deeper understanding of who does have access to the systems and buildings, and just with the kind of increase in the sort of cyber risk and people being able to access systems remotely from anywhere in the world. It's just, if you don't know who's got hands on your system, either virtually or physically, you have problems. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think with such a transient workforce with contractors or contingents or independent consultants, maybe companies don't think deeply enough about the implications of giving access and how to quarantine and shut down that access as well.
Yes. Yeah. It seems to be that, in my experience, onboarding gets focused on.
Yes.
Offboarding kind of gets forgotten.
I think
there's an assumption made that somebody's contract finishes and that somebody in IT is turning off their access, and that doesn't always happen.
Oh, you're so right. You're so right. Yeah. So, Jane, in my experience, which has been similar to yours, a good 25 years or so, I've found it quite concerning around accountability of the sourcing, the contracting and management of non-employees.
Yes.
I haven't had popular feedback around my term, which is a hot potato between HR, procurement,
That's exactly what it is.
What do you see happening, and how can businesses do that more effectively?
Oh, look, it is absolutely a hot potato.
Yes.
I am seeing an increase in focus from HR functions on trying to get their heads around this part of the workforce. And I think that's come from two places. One, during COVID, they actually had to pay attention to where everybody was from a risk management standpoint. So they had to find out who everybody was. And then with obviously the legislation around closing the loopholes, that's also driven a compliance sort of lens from the HR side. I would say it is absolutely a hot potato. And everybody has a slightly different set of interest. When I'm talking to organisations, I recommend that they do this. They focus on the bits that are important to them. So leaders need to focus on what skills and capabilities they need to get the work done to deliver the outcomes for the organisation, with a bit of a lens on cost.
Yep.
HR needs to focus on getting access to those skills and capabilities in the right way, being compliant.
Yep.
Procurement needs to focus on making that a seamless transaction. And so in organisations that do that really well, there is either an MSP or a VMS or something like that in place that then provides that visibility, automates the kind of whole process around, paying these individuals. It removes any contract complexity. Those sorts of things work really well. And that's where procurement works really closely with the HR function to be able to bring those things together and to serve then the leaders and provide them with the skills and capabilities that they need to be able to get on with the work and get the work done.
So, Jane, today's workforce is complex from a multi-generational worker types, remote working, employees, non-employees, independent consultants. How do you feel that managers are equipped to be accountable for managing the complexities of that workforce?
I would say largely poorly. I would say that they don't fully understand the complexity that's involved. And then I step back and I go, well, do they need to understand that?
Good question.
I think they do, not to the depth of perhaps you and I who have been in this space for 25 years, but they need to understand the risks that are associated with the different sort of labour categories and, absolutely to your point, 5 generations in the workforce, that brings its own kind of complexity around, around sort of managing that part of it. But I think, again, when, we were sort of talking before around the sort of support functions, procurement, HR, really being those centres of excellence that leaders can lean on for advice is critical, absolutely critical, because it is complex and you can get yourself in a lot of strife if you're not thinking about all of the different components of that. So you've got to lean on your friends, and that's where procurement and HR come into it.
So, Jane, when it comes to managing, let's say, the contingent workforce, companies typically can go a couple of ways if they want to put a program in place. They can build it themselves internally with the right people and technology, or they could partner with an expert vendor such as a managed service provider. What do you see as the decisions and the ways that companies go for those two options?
Yeah, look, I've in my career done both. I have been the leader of a function that has managed the contingent workforce, put in a VMS and tried to do it ourselves. And then in my next gig, I went, well, that was very hard. Let's bring in the experts and they can do that. Like they really do. It enables you to punch above your weight, basically. If you bring in people and organisations who that's their whole job, that's what they do for a living, it just takes away the headache of trying to keep that part of the workforce compliant and get access to those skills more seamlessly than you otherwise would have to. Yeah,
I agree. I think it's interesting when organisations try to hold on to keep it as a core capability when it could actually be the case that using an outsourced partner for a couple of years even could help you get into better levels of governance, compliance and structure and service.
Absolutely.
And then build the muscle internally if that's what the business wants to do long term.
Yep. And I think, again, like when I sort of think strategic workforce planning, one of the things that I always think about is it better what is the core capability of the organisation? And is it to manage a contingent workforce? Maybe not. Maybe it is to build a widget or to deliver a service, but it's probably not managing a contingent workforce.
Yeah, I feel the same. Jane, we've said a couple of times during this chat that, between the two of us, we've got about 50 years experience in workforce strategy, workforce management.
Yes.
And, I think I'd seen the rise of capability and knowledge within procurement parts of organisations around managing the contingent workforce requirement. I think in the last 5 years in particular, I've seen an increase in, I think, capability and definitely desire for heads of talent or talent management teams to embrace their accountability or an accountability for contingent workforce. What are you seeing?
I completely agree with you. Exactly that. And I think procurement it has definitely kind of stepped up. They get their responsibility, and I think that's terrific. And I think what's happened with talent, and coming back to that kind of first thing that we talked about with skills shortage, you can't be blinkered in a talent function about where you're going to get your capability from. you have to broaden your understanding of where capability sits. And then you've got to be able to get access to that. And so again, leaning on your partners in procurement, being able to get access to that in a frictionless way is really important. But I think the talent leaders, both talent management and talent acquisition, are increasingly being relied upon by leaders in organizations to have that understanding of where they can get capability. And so I think, you're either going to get it internally, you're going to move it around. I mean, this is the strategic, workforce planning, kind of 5 or 6 things, right? You build it, you buy it, you borrow it, there's sort of 6 of them. And so you increasingly, that's where talent management and talent acquisition can really bring their expertise in to help organisations be successful.
Jane, I've had a good 25 years or so in workforce strategy and workforce management. And what I am doing now with my clients is supporting them in order that they can build the case for change of what their business might need. I see that the contingent workforce needs to be profiled from a risk, quality and a value perspective. And I often see that businesses don't know how to do that, to structure either a business case to drive change or to build an internal function or engage a managed service partner. What's your thoughts on that? How deep an expertise might be needed to support a business that way?
Look, I can only say leverage the experts. This is complicated space. If you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you're missing, would be my point. There are so many nuances to this space around, to your point, understanding the value, how you get value out of that workforce, how you manage compliance, how you mitigate risk, how you just get visibility of that workforce. All of those things are a project in themselves. And so to have somebody come in and structure that in a really useful way, I think is absolutely, it's money well spent. In my opinion, I would absolutely recommend that.
So, Jane, in my experience, when we work with companies in assessing their invisible workforce, the contingent workforce, typically there are agency-style contractors or payroll contractors that are generally onboarded and brought in via a panel of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got true service providers that are outsourced consultants, infrastructure, whatever the industry sector might be. And I've seen the rise, particularly in the last 3 to 5 years, of independent consultants that sit in between that. And that's more grey and more difficult for companies to quantify. What do you see as either the cost implications of that sort of segment of the workforce or the additional risks that are prevalent?
Yes, I see that we can quantify the agency worker.
Yeah.
You can quantify the dollars that you are spending on service providers, albeit, again, that is another part of the organisation or the workforce that you can't really put your hands on because they're delivering outcomes. They're not a number of people that you can count with a skill set.
Yeah.
That independent contractor in the middle is really the grey area, and they can cost upwards of 30 to 50% more than a contingent worker that can then cost 20 to 30% more than a permanent worker. So it's that group that are often on statements of work, often brought in not via a panel, often brought in as a colleague or somebody that a leader has worked with before, and they just need that person rather than being more objective about the work that's being done or the skill set that they're bringing to bear. That's where organisations are, frankly, in my opinion, really kind of losing quite a lot of money that they just don't need to spend because there are other ways that you can get access to that capability.
Yeah, I agree completely. And the barriers to entry for independent consultants are not very high. And,
Yes.
a company can be set up, not saying that they don't have the skills and capability to do the work, but it could be misclassified and significantly overspending on what is actually required. Yeah.
Absolutely right. I see that. I have seen that in all of the organisations I've worked in.
So, Jane, if I was to ask you what are the 3 key benefits that companies should be leveraging when accessing a contingent workforce, what would you say they are?
Flexibility would be the first, capacity would be the second, and capability absolutely would be the third.